First, we are going to welcome Justin Agyin. Justin actually completed his graduation project here at the TU Eindhoven. Datapolis, a hyperscale data center for Rotterdam. And then we are also going to hear from Paul Kuipers, who finished his graduation project from the AVB, the Academie van Bouwkunst in Amsterdam, with his project Achterhuis, a house for Edward Snowden. Anyway, we have plenty of issues to discuss, particularly the issues surrounding digital privacy, surveillance capitalism, but also how we are all experiencing this new digital life and how architecture can play a role in making that either more present or less present in our everyday lives. So the setup for today is very simple and straightforward. We will hear from both our guests. They will present their projects, and then we'll have a nice discussion about them. So first, I'd like to invite Justin to tell us about Datapolis. No clapping.
Thank you, Sergio, for the introduction and also the invitation to present and discuss my project together with Paul here in Eindhoven. I will try to be brief, but it's always a challenge. I will briefly first introduce why Datapolis in Rotterdam, so the context, because it also helped shape the project, and then later I will discuss the building and the architecture more in detail. So this is Rotterdam. The Rotterdam city center is here, but the municipality actually stretches all the way to the North Sea, 40 kilometers. This little red dot is Katendrecht, which is a peninsula quite close to the inner city of Rotterdam, and actually is currently being transformed and ever more becoming part of the inner city milieu with new initiatives, food markets, museum, also new architectural developments such as Phoenix Loods 1. And currently also Entree Katendrecht is realized, which is a high-scale and dense urban development near the metro station Maashaven. What interested me in the location after research on Rotterdam and its relationship to water is how this piece of city actually was formed spatially but also socially, and how it's being transformed, and as I showed, but the other half of the peninsula is still sort of up for grab. It has been transformed over time gradually, but there were still some spots left that drew my attention. So I tried to research how I could let the city, and Katendrecht in specific, re-engage with the water through architecture and the quay. And then particularly this part of Katendrecht, as the other part is currently being developed already. What drew me, or what I found in the research, is that certain aspects of the water are very specific to Katendrecht, but also to the presence of water in the city, such as slowness, the vastness, the isolation and distance, and the stillness that it provides, and that the quays have a sort of a pressureless quality to them, that everything is possible, but nothing has to take place per se. Which is a quality that stayed with me throughout the project. How Katendrecht came to be was actually a radical transformation in the way port logic worked. It transformed from Waterstad, water city, which you can see here towards the end of the 17th century, that in the south part of the booming port city, there was really this mix between architecture, urbanism, and water. For instance, you see it here at the Boompjeskade, that you had a representative front towards the river, and then in the back you had shipyards. And here you can see one of the most important public spaces of the city. Also the trade took place, the ships were there, and then here you had the representative front with the imposant architecture. Now the 19th century port was radically different in the sense that it was much more powered by machines, steam engine machines. These are grain elevators, And transshipment no longer took completely place between water and land, but also took place on water, and that's why they needed large water basins, and that's how Katendrecht came to be, because it was 2 large water basins were dug out, and then the peninsula was left, which was only connected to the rest of the city through a small path here or through the ferry. Here you can see it in a panorama of the southern side of the Maas River of the city. And in this photo you can clearly see how Katendrecht as a neighborhood became an island isolated on a peninsula and was encapsulated by all kinds of port infrastructure and activities. And over time this led that it became, it was not only a geographical, on the geographic periphery of the city, but also on the societal periphery of the city, because a lot of things could take place, such as prostitution, gambling, opium use, and all kinds of things that were somewhat not or sometimes were tolerated, but which happen in any large city. And Katendrecht as a spatial location also was it was allowed for those things to take place there. However, the people living there at a certain point, of course, did no longer tolerate this and wanted transformation. That's what gradually happened. So here, towards the end of the 1980s, transformations do happen and more residences are added. And also the port activities are leaving, and these are the first transformations. And then in the 90s and early zeros, you have more transformations, also introducing new types of residents, usually people who are not necessarily affiliated with the port industry as was before in the historic core. Now these transformations spatially left also an important mark on Katendrecht, resulting in morphological fragments. And between those fragments, you have the long lines of sight that were previously long lines for the port infrastructure, mainly rail infrastructure. And perpendicular to that, you have short cross connections. And the relationship between the urban and architectural situation is that also sequentially you have this sort of encapsulated view that's provided by the architecture. Then when you move on, you have it starts to open up, and then towards the edge of the peninsula, you have these horizontal panoramas. Now, these type of spatial characteristics of the location, I also try to translate into architectural objects, and I introduced 5 on these between these morphological fragments that play into these characteristics, introduce a new program, and then also collectively they migrate from land to water, from morphology to autonomy, together as a urban strategy composed of 5 architectural objects. And briefly what they do is that they frame views towards the water and the remaining port activities there, and also introduce new program that's related to the context. So, for instance, this is a building block with residential units. This is an office block that functions as a a separation between this new development, the existing historic core, the developments from the 90s and the early zeros, and also this monumental grain silo, and also forms an urban square. Here is another residential building that is at this pivoting point between the residential area and the more open parking spaces that are related to the SS Rotterdam, and provides also a soft quay so that you can also come closer to the water and enjoy it. Here at the tip, I completed the tip, and then in the base of the building there's a water terminal that where ferries can dock water taxis, water buses, and so on. And through the building there's a cableway that goes from the Euromast to an amusement park, which is currently being built as part of this more entertainment corridor through in the city, and also providing a new way of how to cross the water. And then finally there's Datapolis, which is an autonomous building of 240 meters by 70 meters that houses a data center, a hyperscale data center, and also introduces a new type of industry in this former port area. There are three sort of lines that I got from the historical development of Rotterdam in relationship to which led for me to develop this building. And has to do with the metropolitan quality of Rotterdam. So one is the global interconnectedness that was manifested through architecture, which can, for instance, be seen here. This is the Koolsingel, and along the Koolsingel you had the city hall, the post office, which also housed the telecom and telegraph offices, and next to it the stock exchange. And there are more examples in Rotterdam of how these sort of global infrastructures and networks land in the city through specific types of architecture and buildings. Another one of those is, for instance, Witte Huis, that was also positioned in the corner of the river, so that from each side approaching the city, you could see it, and also, for instance, from the train. And also these type of technological sort of infrastructures, they also provided new views on the city, new perspectives on the city, and which were also heavily used in cinema and other creative outings. Second is the collective celebration of technological progress. So Rotterdam had this sort of tradition of hosting every 5 years a large manifestation in the park, which is literally called the park. Rebuilding of the ports after the bombardment in the 1940s. Then in 1955 it was a large manifestation on innovation in energy and also chemistry. And then in 1960 there was the Floriade, which gave Rotterdam the Euromast, which was a celebration of technological progress in the horticultural industry. And also, which was prominent in the park, was a cableway connecting north and south, which of course also resonates in my project. And the third one is a bit more complex, but it's emptiness, which is still, even though the inner city has been rebuilt and is being even densified much more now, there's still this quality or this presence of emptiness in Rotterdam, which you can notice, well, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, which is sort of entrenched in the city, in its architecture, but especially in its urban setup, which also had to do with the master plan that was drawn up, or the basis plan that was drawn up for the construction of Rotterdam's inner city, which was not a master plan that was in which parcels and building blocks were heavily defined, but it was more about flows, facilitating offices, but also the port industry and all kinds of other developments, with quite a small role for housing actually. But it also allowed, and also this sort of connection to the water, the openness and the vastness of the water. There was, especially of Van Tra, the designer of the basis plan, was important. And later up it was of course blocked by a new construction. So these were the three lines that sort of led me to think about how can this new industry, a data center, also benefit the city in different ways than only providing sort of this new infrastructure, which is needed if we, well, we see it on a daily basis, but we can also hear it on a daily basis from all kinds of experts. But then it could also do something for the city. So how could it be a beacon for this emergent industry, a collective celebration of progress, and offer a multitude of new perspectives to view the city? So that's what I try to achieve through my design. So sort of a double role of this building, of housing this new industry and providing this new urban aspects in an architectural object. And that is reflected here, for instance, in the plan. So I will briefly go through the technical aspects of the data center. So here you see this is the ground floor plan. Here you see the loading dock. here the generator room, air handling units, power substation, leaving to the ground floor mainly being occupied by the technical apparatus that's required to operationalize this type of data center, with on the north and south ends of the building entrances, and also one on the side towards the central void, which I will discuss later. And this presence, technological presence, is also reflected in the building. So here in the base, you see there is a continuation of air vents with sometimes interruption of an entrance. Then in the midsection, you have large server floors, large open floors with server units. And then in the top of the building, the top 2 floors occupy cooling towers. And you see also air vents again coming back there, but then smaller in this sort of encasing. And in the basement, there's also a water plant, because it's a water-cooled data center. But as I mentioned earlier, I tried to introduce the public domain in Datapolis for it to become more than only this technical machine in the heart of the city. And I did this in 3 ways. One is through with the introduction of 4 distinct public functions: swimming pool, auditorium, watchtower, which has offices and a control room, and a restaurant. Each one protrudes through one of the elevations. So here you see the swimming pool in the ground floor. Now on the 2nd floor there's the auditorium, which you can get to through a monumental staircase in the center. And then on the 5th floor you have the watchtower with offices here and a control room, and then a restaurant overlooking the city, providing a view over the city in contrast to a view on the water, as was important for Cornelis van Tra, hence the name Restaurant van Tra. These are connected through a public route, which also, so this is the swimming pool, and the public route also allows views into the enclosed spaces where you are not allowed as a visitor. So these are the server spaces. Then you go to the auditorium, and here there's a large deck from which you can also again view the port in the distance. This is the control room. And then you end up in the restaurant overlooking the city. You can from there go over the roof landscape and experience the cooling towers. And then revert back to the central void. And then the central void in particular is sort of antidote towards this sort of hermetic logic of a data center in which you are everything is controlled climatically, but also who is allowed in and out. And the central void, the idea of the central void, is to be sort of a poetic counter answer to that by offering a permanent public space in which, again, everything can take place, but nothing has to, a bit like the sort of pressureless quality that quays have in Rotterdam, or some of them have, who haven't been transformed yet. And there's not necessarily a function there, but you are exposed to the elements, and it is permanently open without fences and doors and gates and so on. That was my presentation. Thank you.
There's only 2 of us, so it doesn't really echo the clapping, right? But thank you, Justin, for presenting your project. A little bit too long, but I guess we'll make do with that. Well, you already see him. It's my pleasure to invite Paul to present his own project, the Achterhuis. Go ahead, Paul. Thank you.
Achterhuis, it has, well, first of all, thank you, Sergio and Yasin, to be here, and welcome to the invisible public, which is quite a theme in my project as well. Yeah, Achterhuis. It has a new title in the meantime. It's called Host Edward Snowden, an encrypted place for the whistleblower. But that's because this will also be an entry for the Archiprix International, and then Achterhuis might be a difficult word to explain, but I will come later to that. For me, it all started with this documentary about Edward Snowden. Citizen 4, Edward Snowden, the whistleblower who revealed the reality of mass surveillance and data exploitation by our governments and let's say the trillion-dollar companies like Google, Apple, Verizon, Amazon. Well, you can fill them in, which is of course a grave violation of our right to privacy. And yeah, this subject really fits into my own practice, which I started in 2015-16, and it's pretty much embedded in social political issues, political context. So you can read my project as a spatial manifesto to address important terms as transparency and the right to privacy in a well-functioning democracy. I'm not gonna explain my whole building because I want to leave a secret, of course. I'm not gonna explain how it exactly works, but believe me, I know the meaning and function of every space in my building. I like to tell this afternoon a little bit about my process because it's pretty much important for my practice to make experimental architecture, and that's what I like to do in my work, and to question, let's say, the architectural toolbox, the principles, or the forms of organization, materiality, space, typologies, but also new agendas to address new topics. What I did is extracting some terms from my subject, my protagonist, Edward Snowden, and the digital world, transparency, privacy, and security. It's quite obvious, actually. I have to limit myself here this afternoon, but these are the most in the eye-jumping terms. But these terms are also part of my own discipline, architecture, and then it becomes interesting for me. Well, I have to add that, let's say, if you think about transparency, of course, I ask myself, should I build a complete transparent building? Or maybe I should not design a building at all, maybe something more ephemeral, like a cloud, or maybe even a temporary building. But what I like to do in my work is to introduce a kind of a paradox, opposite terms, to bring in the tension in the design process, and on the yeah, where these terms collide. That is there I find my inspiration. And thinking about transparency, I wanted to do the complete opposite. So I started with the black and the mass and the heavy stuff, the earthy stuff. And I started looking at castles and fortresses and bunkers and even palaces, expensive architecture. And what always fascinates me is those very specific rooms with a specific form connected to a specific function. As if they are carved out this underground, as if it is an underground building lifted up and standing in the open air above the ground. A second thing is the organization of rooms and the connection with corridors and corridors that are not always interconnected. So there's also this labyrinthic feeling when you walk through. I think everybody has this feeling, right? This experience walking in this what we can call the wall of rooms in, let's say, the wall of a castle. This labyrinthic feeling, this feeling of confusion, that was something that became very important in my project. And of course, the labyrinth was also a very important reference for me, not only because of the confusion, which we can use to secure ourselves, but also the element of fun. And you have the long path leading to the circle, and with a lot of detours, in the end you reach the center. which seemed to me very appropriate for a building meant for somebody who's living in a complete lockdown, a lockdown avant la lettre, because he is made stateless, he has no passport, he can't move freely around because he is, after his revelation, he had to flee to Hong Kong, and now he is living in a very inconvenient asylum in Russia. It becomes part of a sort of Cold War conflict between Putin and Trump. So enlarging the path through the building to make his world bigger, as if he can take every day another route through his building. And the last one is the famous map of Rome made by Nolli in the 18th century, where we see the difference between the accessible and inaccessible spaces. And it was kind of a metaphor for me, the black spaces as the space for Snowden where he is hidden, and the open spaces more well-defined and representing the public program in a building. Because I didn't want to make a shelter somewhere hidden in the landscape, guarded by policemen, but I want to have a building for him and for where he stands for in the vibrant center of the city, guarded by the community. So, well, this is a little sketch in between, and you see my idea about this building turning upside down the defensive tower into an opening tower. Whereas in the building, in the meanwhile, Snowden is somewhere hidden, but we don't know where. Well, here, well, you recognize it again. Here it comes all together, and what I did is I was making my whole design in the flat surface, and then I rotated it 90 degrees, so a square becomes, for instance, a space. This was a perfect occasion for something I never did before, but let's call it an academic exercise. Sorry, and what we call a mass void study by making matrices and molds and then cast with plaster and concrete. It's good to tell that at this point I didn't have a program and I didn't have a location. Maybe you're waiting, where is this building situated? But it was more or less on purpose. I always want to start a project first with my imagination and an interpretation of the subject and certain architectural principles. And then later on in the progress, I want to focus it on the more practical and technical parts that also come with architecture. Of course, it was not coming out of the blue totally. I had already ideas in my head about what kind of building I wanted to make. And it feels a little bit like working as a scenographer or as a movie director with different scenes. And how they come together, that was something that I had to solve in the end. So I started with different models on the positive and the negative, with sequences of spaces and disorderly organized spaces, and well, and so on and so on. So I was exploring with this casting process, exploring as well on spaces as details and materials. And in the end, I had quite a table full of models, building up an archive or a cache, as I called it, for myself, to analyze and to look back and how can I compose out of all these elements a building. In the meantime, of course, coming up with a location and a program, but that came along the casting process. I'm just giving one example here. That is the circular space, which became the central space in my building. And yeah, you can call it a belvedere because the public can go up there and take the stairs. You come on a platform of 5-6 meters high, and you have a very nice view on the garden where my building is projected. Yeah, that was quite logical because apparently here you see some examples where the circle is appearing And apparently I had a favor for rhombuses and for circles, and also thinking about how it can be appropriated. Um, yeah, how it can be appropriated, and especially by the public, because I want to have this mix of the yeah, of, let's say, the host Snowden and the public that is going through the building. The paradox where I was talking about is pretty much in my processes as well. It's constantly shifting to analog and digital. Again, it's very nice. Yeah, you can call it a dichotomy, and it would have been yeah, maybe if you talk about Edward Snowden, then it might be logical to dive into more into the digital. But I started with this method, which is very analog, and I left the computer completely out this time. So only at the end, and here you see on the left side, you see this on the left side. Yeah, you see the model. And what I did, I put it on the scanner and I traced it in AutoCAD and adjusted a little bit, did some corrections, proportions and dimension-wise. And then in the end, my model was so complex that I had to produce my final models with the computer. And I had then the drawings for the laser and CNC cutters. In my process, spatial encryption, that word is now also in the title, became very important. Also to trigger my own imagination, I started to introduce the vocabulary of the internet or the digital world, and not in a very precise way. I'm not an expert, and I'm not a scripter for websites, but it's more loosely, and it really helped me to when I was translating this in the architectural equivalence, to think in a different way about my program, about my building, and also triggering associations, which is very important for me. So firewall and host and protocol, it all became architecture in my project. And then shortly about my location, I projected it in Amsterdam, following Russell Sorto, who wrote this book, The Most Tolerant City of the World. Well, let's face it then, and I projected it in the center of Amsterdam. I found the inner gardens at the closed building block in the canal belt, a perfect place to hide. Of course, it's also a little wink to the history of Anne Frank. Although the Achterhuis is not an Anne Frank invention, it is an Amsterdam typology. And the Achterhuis, it's difficult to translate. As I said, it's the house and the backside and facing the garden. So what I'm literally doing is taking away the existing Achterhuizen and replace it with a new one connecting the Herengracht and the Keizersgracht, connecting two canals. And it cuts through the house in the front, and it has a secretive appearance at the canal side. Well, then I casted my conceptual model again, and now it's projected in my location model. And here you see it called the interface, the incision in the classic facades of the grachtenhuizen, the canal houses. And on the left side, you see a sort of copy of the existing staircase that leads to the house itself. And it's not only for Snowden, but also for his guests and friends and family, activists, hacktivists who are visiting him. And I added also a janitor and a cook to the household, so they are living with 3 people there. And on the right side of this of the block of this monolith, is a sort of secretive entrance for the public. And that's it.
Thank you for that very thorough presentation, although you didn't talk about what you said you weren't going to talk about, but what you did talk about, the process, you were very thorough and explains a lot from what we can already see from the exhibition,
Yeah.
but also what you show us today. These are two very compelling projects. They seem to have a lot of moments in which they touch upon each other, but also a lot of moments where they seem to diverge. I mean, if I would have to put it in very simple terms, there is sort of a celebration of technology and somehow a rejection of technology.
Oh, no.
No?
No.
So please correct me. Go ahead.
No. It's not that I'm against technology at all. Of course, it's nice we have Skype and we have and now in Corona times we have Teams and Zoom and name it. And now the thing is, now I'm pretty much in favor of technology. But there's one thing we forget is that in the innovation of technology, we always forget to define the moral code. And I think that it's strange when cars and computers, everything is
Moving so rapidly.
is moving forward and in progression. Our regulations and the conditions and the law is a static thing. That's very strange. I mean, technology is a very nice thing.
No, I didn't mean like you wanted to go back to this idealized, romanticized period that there was no technology. I meant more in, let's say, in what your two projects show, that you somehow are trying to hide it behind the, the canals of Amsterdam, despite the very sleek interface that you produce. While Justin takes a very different approach, which is put it straight. I mean, I know that your project is more than Datapolis, so just I know that, but we are just going to sort of focus on Datapolis also because that's the building that gives title to your project and that you focus the most. But the point, let's say that the point of divergence between the two that I see most clearly, particularly in architectural terms, is that one seems to want to celebrate this newfound displacement that is produced by data centers, and the other one is trying, yours in this case, is trying to warn us about the, let's say, the underbelly of such displacement.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that by hiding something, maybe you're even more stressing the presence of it. Of course, you can build something right in your face. Let's say what you did as creating an own island, actually, in front of the quay. And my building is more or less hidden. But I think that's also an important part of the experience we can have in the city, like visiting a monastery with a closed garden. So it shouldn't be always so much in your face.
No, my question, but I also want to move on to Justin. But my question is more in the sense that a lot of the conditions and a lot of the reasons why we see that technology moves so fast and the ethical code, the moral code, and even to many degrees the legal code trails behind is also because a lot of these changes are somehow made invisible by technology. For example, the shift of computing power to data centers makes us think that we have a really powerful device in our pockets, which we do, but it's made incredibly more powerful by this all these data centers that are somewhere continuously pumping information into our pocket that really offsets the cost of that device. And by cost, I mean the cost in terms of data, the cost in terms of energy consumption, the cost in terms of anything that you can imagine has been offset to an offshore site most of the times that is really out of sight, out of mind. And that is the part that I find really intriguing about your project. And I think in your discussion or in your presentation in the exhibition, it states even that there seems to be sort of paradox of discussing transparency and yet having a building that is somewhat quite hidden. But maybe we get to that. Maybe we hear the reasoning for having such a present and dominant building as a way to present a data center in the middle of a city, which is, of course, not so common.
No, the idea was the opposite, to not hide it, because they are sort of hidden already, or at least out of sight, out of mind, which I find very interesting because they are gigantic buildings, but not really present in our daily lives physically, but we are constantly engaging with them through interfaces, digital interfaces. So I was thinking, this is happening, what would happen if you would put it in the city and we are confronted with it and maybe can even visit it. And to not to celebrate it maybe in a certain way, but at least become also aware of it.
Does it normalize the condition? That is also a big question.
No,
for me.
well, one of the interesting questions I got during my final presentation of the project was if I would build it, because it is at this very nice location in Rotterdam. It would completely sort of obstruct the view that characterizes the city. So in that sense, it doesn't necessarily normalizes it, I think, because yeah, you would be confronted with it, but maybe not completely, not always in a positive way.
You make it look like a residential block. That is very purposeful, right?
Well, yes, but it's quite large as a residential block.
240 meters by 70.
And 70 meters tall also. And the question was if it was purposeful to make it look like a residential block. Yeah, in typology maybe it is. But it's also to sort of carve out this empty space in the center.
What do you mean by that, carving out empty space?
Well,
I think that's what Paul is doing, carving out an empty space in the city center and allowing for the community to become sort of the gatekeepers to Edward Snowden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I also found interesting in the sense, at least for one of the qualities that I had or still have when I visit Rotterdam, is that you have sort of, when you visit the quay, you are confronted with the water, but you can also be together, but you can also be alone, or you can be alone together with more people who observe it alone, and sort of that pressureless.
Very Corona.
Yeah, very Corona, of course. I was also avant la lettre. But that sort of pressureless, this idea of you can do everything there, but nothing has to take place, to sort of insert that in one of the most specified and most secured and closed off buildings that we build nowadays. That was sort of one of the interesting things that the things that sort of triggered me to make it into that shape also.
I think that both your projects actually work on many different levels, but they utilize a lot of paradoxes, either in the way to design the building, the process that you just showed us, but also in this way of making it very present and yet very inaccessible, despite the sort of the functions that are there. Right. So I wonder what do you think that paradox and contradictions and tensions, how are that useful for the development of, let's say, speculative architecture, because in the end that's what both your projects are. How useful is this sort of tension?
You first.
Well, I think it's useful to sort of express paradoxes that are present all the time everywhere in our daily lives, but usually in sort of the development, the logic of how we develop architecture and spaces is sort of very singular. It's going to be this building, and you have to do this, smoothing out things, prescribe spaces, what happens there. You have to consume coffee there, and you can go to a concert there, and then in between we are all happy together in a square or something like that. But
are you just describing your building?
Well,
that's how you presented it, at least.
Well, it's parts of it, but sort of I hope in the way that I visualized it sort of shows that it doesn't have to be happy and people holding a balloon in a render and stuff like that. Not that I am necessarily against
being
that,
sad in the central courtyard.
Exactly. Being allowed to feel sad in the central courtyard.
And your central space, because you mentioned that your central space, the round space, was accessible by the public. What was this idea behind introducing the public to Edward Snowden, or to his home, let's say? What was your goal with that?
Well, I think the first is paradox thing, but maybe there's a relation between those two. Is that first of all, it has a function for me as a designer, because I want to. I mean, I think your plan is more on an an urban scale level. You know, it was 1 or 5 buildings, and you worked one out, I guess, or did you work out all the 5?
No,
No.
I didn't have the time
Okay.
for that.
Phew. You're a genius. Now, for me to develop my own language, signature, to make something idiosyncratic, because I strongly believe in that. That's the way I want to express myself. And for me, architecture is not a puzzle or a technical thing, and beginning with a program location. Yeah, of course I do that as well in my own practice, but I try to use the imagination is in front of my process. Very important. Um, but I'm not gonna have a conversation with, let's say, security guards and internet specialists. I start with my own interpretation of it. So I'm saying, okay, this is not a bunker guarded by policemen. My brother is a policeman. I have talked with him. I know exactly how it goes. I know how it goes with Geert Wilders and all that kind of people. Now I wanted to have something in the middle of the center, which is vulnerable, but at the same time, I strongly believe that we can protect it by the with the community, by the community, they say, by the community. And so without cameras and all that stuff. So, but if we are gonna build it, okay, then we gonna start a discussion. But first, I want to have the word at the table, and can we solve the problem in this way? So it's an internal thing. The paradox. This is for my design process. But that's
So
not.
the people?
But that's sorry.
No, that answers the question.
No,
How
yeah.
valuable
Oh, yeah,
the
the people.
paradox is
Yeah, the people
for.
is the paradox is also that the private bunker is of course close to the people. It's inaccessible. That is the opposition I find in a Nolly map. Well, in my head. He is serving a public debate, so he is also welcoming the people. There's a public theater, for instance, for debate. Let's say something like the Bali in Amsterdam. Um, and you might have the chance that Edward Snowden is giving there a lecture. So I mean, he is not hunted by snipers, right? I mean, his world
You
is.
never know.
Yeah, you never know with Trump at power. But it's more that he has no passport. He can travel. That's the problem.
No, I understand, but I see that there's another paradox, and I think you also addressed it a little bit in the text that you wrote for your project in the exhibition, which is you are providing him with a home, and because he has revealed that we have no privacy, he himself is doomed to having no privacy, and that for me is peculiar because I would imagine that even though you would want to cater to have a space where he could reach out and give lectures or have discussions and have people over and whatnot, that he becomes someone to be looked at, right? That he doesn't have his own privacy in his own home. But then again, you didn't explain the entire project, so I can imagine that there are private areas to the project.
Yeah, well, my idea about the building, and it is the organization is like this, that the private spaces are separated from the public spaces, but they are in a sort of, how do you say?
Interwoven.
Yeah, interwoven, like like an entangled dance, and the whole rooftop is private space for him as a rooftop terrace, and he can look over the other rooftops, and he has a sort of an perspective on the city. But the outdoor space in the middle has a public side to it, so you can reach it with a staircase, and you can read a book there. You can just use it as a detour in the city. So I really wanted to integrate it in the existing city and not. Maybe it's interesting to tell this. I started with these castles and palaces and fortresses, and these buildings are always autonomous buildings in the landscape. They were standing outside the city, and maybe not anymore, but then they are swallowed, by the expanding city. If you want to build something like that in the city, then it becomes an iconic building. It's very difficult. And then I thought, no, it's more it's more close to my subject when I find a space where I can hide it a little bit and turn it into, let's say, a public secret, sort of something you can find by surprise. And that's also thinking about how we experience the city. I mean, that's what I mean with right in your face. When I visit cities, it's always behind the behind the scenes that I have my nicest experiences. Or maybe from hearsay, did you see? Did you have you take this route? No, not yet.
But that
I
leads
missed
to
it.
to another interesting, let's say, divergence between the two projects,
Hmm.
which is the role of context
Yeah.
and the role of the actual location of the project.
Yeah.
Because Justin, you spent a lot of time discussing the history of Rotterdam, the history of that particular piece of the harbor, and then your most important building is actually completely separate from it. It's autonomous. You said yourself was from morphology to autonomy, right? And you actually have the opposite, which you start by saying, I don't have a location, and yet your final product is really embedded in a very particular location.
Yeah,
And
quite
tries
monumental.
yes, very monumental, actually, both.
But don't forget that a building for Snowden and some other people. It's not only Snowden, but let's say there are activists and people coming, if family, is a big difference than when you make a building for data processors and a lot of technique. I see this assignment in this kind of projects in architecture reminds me of, let's say, parking garages. When we had this upcoming mobility in the 50s, we saw an enormous change in infrastructure and also a new type of building, the parking garage. And they were always ugly, they were always a kind of an obstructive element in the city. So in that sense, I really like that you do at least an attempt to integrate urban life and in the building. Sorry.
Do you wanna
I mean,
talk
there
about
are a
that?
lot of examples, and you know better than me, I guess. Data centers, which were also kind of a monolith leads in the neighborhood. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
So in that sense, this is I think that's nice when we can connect and even turn it into entertainment. I mean, I saw people flying on your
Yeah.
building.
Do you want to talk about the role of context in your building?
Well, I think it's sort of two ways. So one is, I think, the spatial uh, way of how it's positioned is sort of both to provide new perspectives on the city, so new points of view towards the city, but also to create friction, which I also discussed a bit earlier, like that it's also obstructing views and it's very dominantly present from on nice spots in the city. And then the other way of context is, I think, sort of the historical development of Rotterdam and its relationship to progress, because it has been promoted and still is promoted as one of the most modern cities of the Netherlands, adopting all these technologies, especially in the port infrastructure and so on, celebrating it even, which I found interesting. Also, an interesting duality, sort of, because this is sort of a thing happening, all these data centers. So what happens if we put it in the city, and then can it become both part of this sort of more celebratory trajectory that is present in Rotterdam, but also this more sort of friction. What you can do with, I think,
Friction between functions, you mean, right?
Yeah, between functions, but also between positioning such a large building in that location in the city, in the prominent location in the city.
So how does it affect, how does it change the context? Is it just by its sheer presence, by its size? Because you talk a lot about how context has influenced the design of the project, but then my question is, for both of you actually, is how does your project affect the context? What gets changed from it? What gets changed by having this sort of hidden building with two interfaces on the canals in Amsterdam, which I maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think many people actually live in the canals anymore. No, it's a very expensive area. mostly companies, I would
No,
suppose. And
yeah.
how does it affect what is up until now an area that is being redeveloped? So what is it the catalyst for?
Yeah, I didn't approach it in this way actually. I approached it more like the meaning of the building or the symbol that the building is symbolizing, and adding a very small thing actually in the city. It's just a little detour, but I think wow, I'm pretty much in favor, as I earlier said, of this particular kind of experiences that goes far beyond Snowden or whatever the topic is. I mean, maybe my next project will be on the same location as I projected my project about Snowden. It's about also when I look at a city, I want to have this surprises and this secret or public secret experiences.
But you see, that's where I think your projects end up coming together again,
Yeah, yeah. I just
which
wanted
is
to
in this
say.
sort of
Yeah.
autonomous expression of architecture and this, I wouldn't say retreat, but an expression of architecture's own vocabulary and language, even when it's attempting to express other type of issues and concerns that exist all around us beyond architecture. I don't know if you agree with a certain autonomy to your project.
Yeah, I think so. But I think what I also find interesting in your project, and I think at least what also I try to sort of capture with that central void, is that you provide spaces where you can do stuff, where you can go, but you don't have to do anything, or you don't have to consume. For instance, you don't. You provide something different to the city, or maybe not different, but something new. I think answering your previous question on what does it add to the context,
How does it affect the context?
Yeah, it's adding something that's not existent in the city yet as a public space that can be appropriated and visited, and it's not necessarily prescribed what has to happen there.
Is it prescribed in your building what has to happen there? It is a
No.
bit, no?
Never. I always try to make things that are a little bit cryptic. So can I sit on it or not, or can I have a party here, or can I drink here? That is no, it's not. I really like that kind of that
Ambiguity.
moment. Yeah, that ambiguity. So I think that's why it looks also a little bit. No, it's not defined. It's not that you can say that. It refers maybe to something.
That's actually maybe the last point of the conversation that I would like us to take, which is the idea of meaning, of referring to something,
Yeah.
and how in your own two projects you've developed or used certain architectural tools to achieve that meaning. The question that I have for you is not only which meaning you are trying to prescribe or ascribe to your project, but who do you think that meaning is for? Who would understand it?
Maybe nobody, maybe everybody. It is
Ambiguous.
it's yeah, but the thing is that I think sometimes it feels for me like I'm pretty happy to be an architect because we have such a nice and rich history. That's my first resource, besides literature and movies and documentaries, blah blah blah. About principles, materials, what I said, a lot. And it feels like I have to swallow it, I have to chew on it, I have to feel it, what it means, like a method actor playing a role, and then spit it back and spit it out back to the world. And then there is, but not as a copy, not get rid of that, but there's a slight the possibility of a slight association. That is for me very important. So I'm pretty happy when people come up with nicknames of my building. So it looks like a machine, or it is a keyhole, or it's an aperture, or it's a tin can, or it's then I'm and even the negative ones. It's very good. It's like we are giving buildings sometimes this is nicknamed, a good word for it, like at the Swan, the Erasmusbrug in Rotterdam. So yeah, yeah, then I'm happy. So when it works on this level of association.
And your level of association, Justin?
Less clear, maybe. I don't know. You said it looks like a residential building.
But it is a residential building, no? You said that it's a mix of data center and residential building, or not?
No, not residential. It's public
Public.
function, so you cannot
So
live there.
those 5 public functions are. I thought they were
It looks like
apartment blocks.
because of the facade.
Yeah, the rhythm of the facade and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
window.
So that was a thing. So first, no windows, because why would you put the windows in a data center? But the idea was that it has how do you call it, milk glass, opaque glass,
Yeah.
so that it would illuminate at night, for instance. So in terms of meaning, or at least in terms of architectural instruments that I try to utilize, is to sort of see it as this sort of this block of concrete and bricks that does nothing basically, but try to sort of sculpt it that it would change if you go around it on water or land by using I forget all the English words now.
Very in Dutch.
Pilasters, for instance, so that sticks out, and these windows that would glow up at night, and also introduce certain plasticity to the facade, so that in sunlight, but also the way you move around it, from one end it looks very flat, but then if you look at it diagonally, it becomes very ribbed, for instance.
You see, this is again one of those points that the two projects diverge, because your materiality is understood and perhaps even appreciated mostly from an exterior perspective as you approach the building, as you go around the building. That's how you describe it. While that's not true for the Achterhuis, because it's only once you enter into the building that you appreciate the labyrinthine quality of it, the sequence of spaces.
Yeah.
So it's another point of divergence, but it makes both buildings very rich in architectural terms.
Yeah, but it's also, well, we have different way of working, and I could formulate, let's say a question about your project is the public pool and the flying people on the rooftop using the wind, is that something that came because there is this over the extra heat of the processor? Is it something that stimulates you to think about a fantastic machine and showing the people what it means that we are online all the time and we are gathering around on an enormous rock of data processors? But maybe it's more my fascination to drag it a little bit more in the James Bond feeling. I mean, if I'm critical, then I think it's very neatly done. The drawings and recognize immediately the urban program, and okay, in the end we have the flying man, and I think, oh yeah, here's it starting. Now we're celebrating technology. That's what I a little bit missed, but maybe that's the next step.
Interaction between
or maybe
the
you're a different designer. I mean, you start with a very profound analysis of the Katendrecht and the urban development, and maybe you want to work together with an architect who goes crazy and wild on the more technical side of the data explosion reality. It's a new word.
So I think it's like I described before, it's not necessarily about, for me, about also showing how much fun you can have there, because you cannot have that much fun, at least not experiencing. So I wanted to make it an operational data center that could work. Still, for security reasons, you could never integrate these kinds of functions, actually. But sort of in as much as possible that it remains secured and closed and functional and operational, and then sort of have at points have this sort of friction and introduction between public being present very close to servers, which they usually don't like. Actually, one in Rotterdam allows, sometimes gives tours, which I also had, which was quite interesting. but
Well,
it's also quite boring.
no, it's
and
not boring because
no, I mean
you
what
say
happens, but in terms of scale and in
yeah.
terms of certain parts of the technology can be very interesting, of course, to experience and go there. But for me, it was not too sort of over to make that the central theme of the
No, I
project.
know, but I'm questioning the architectural language that you need to bring those things together. I mean, I'm pretty aware that you can't come close to the data center because they need a certain climate and they need to be protected. But that has consequences and for the architectural language. I mean, look at bunkers. They look like yeah, how they
They look like bunkers.
they look like bunkers. They
protected,
because
solid thick
yeah,
walls.
it's kind of an
mostly
armor.
underground.
This is the corset, you know, to protect your body against bombshells. Um, yeah. So that is the relation I'm looking for. Is what kind of language do you can you use to bring those things together? And is it generating a complete new architectural? Is it creating a new typology maybe? You know, instead of now it looks a little like factory slash residential building, but it's also interesting because that's what I mean, you know, is what is it exactly? Is it residential or is it factory? So I'm
It's
wondering how
ambiguous. It's ambiguous.
it's ambiguous.
It seems that ambiguity is the right word.
Can I also ask one
Yeah,
question?
of course.
Or at least maybe one topic I find interesting is that the community. Yeah, maybe. So I think maybe the question underneath that question is so. Do we want it? Because you briefly mentioned something like, do we have to protect him through cameras and other type of technological device, or can we do it as a community? So maybe also the question is, do we always need technology to do a certain thing, or can we come together as the? I think it poses the question: what kind of society do we want to be by inviting Snowden over, proving that Amsterdam is this tolerant city, and can we then solve it as a community? Rather than building a bunker, I guess, to just hide him in the Achterhuis. Is that one of the things that was also important for you in the project, or? I mean, that question
society.
of is technology. Do you always need to have technology to sort of achieve a certain goal?
Do we need technology to achieve a certain goal? I don't fully understand the question actually.
No, I think
mean,
maybe I can try and if I understand what you're trying to say. I think the question that Justin is trying to pose, but I think it's a question also for yourself, by the way, which is what does the instrumentalization of particular technology says about us as a society, and the uses and misuses that we do of certain technologies project us or present us as a society. So if there are things that can be taken over as a community, shouldn't we just do it as a community rather than relying on certain technological devices to do so? Is that your question?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm critical about it, then about this new technologies, is that I have the tendency to go back to the social aspect of control. So it's quite absurd that our public space is so dominated by cameras. For instance, take a train station. It looks like a prison with the card and constantly being filmed. And I don't want to go back to the 19th century and saying, okay, there's one janitor living in a building who is closing off the station before nightfall. But yeah, we have to be very critical about this. But at the same time, I'm not sure if maybe I'm drifting away now, but at the same time, I'm completely obsessed with new technologies. I think I'm a complete binge watcher of science fiction movies. And there's always, yeah, well, there is it again, the ambiguity is the utopian part and the dystopian part. And the dystopian part brings us only in a cynical mood, but it's important to remind us of the fact that how do we deal with the new technologies. So
I think that's exactly where you started.
Yeah.
Actually, in this conversation today, that's exactly where
Yeah.
you started. Is how do we deal with new technologies, and that technologies move at a certain pace, and that no moral or ethical codes are made for it.
Yeah.
I mean that we as a society can agree of, and this is full of ambiguity, it's full of gray areas, but that we cannot agree on how certain technologies should be used or should not be abused. And we end up having to need an Edward Snowden to tell us how actually these things are being deployed on us,
Yeah.
On everyone.
Another thing is, of course, the enormous energy consuming side of the new technology, and that's something for the next debate. That's a difficult one as well.
Yeah, that was part of the question that I had before about the making it overt or
Yeah.
hiding it. Because when someone is looking at the skyline of Rotterdam and is seeing lights going on and most likely humming of thousands of server boards,
Yeah.
they become aware, oh, there must be some power being used by that little thing there that
Yeah.
allows me to check Facebook and see nice videos of cats.
Yeah, we are getting curfews. Then you're not allowed to go on the street after 7 o'clock in the evening or something.
So you go online.
Yeah.
So you go online. Okay, I think we're going to finish there. Thank you both for coming, for presenting your projects, for having your projects in the Archiprix. They're very stimulating projects, and I'm always very glad to discuss speculative projects that have the ambition to push our ideas forward as a society. And I'm very glad that you could come and discuss them and we could talk about them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.